So we're going to move forward in chapter 3 talking about plants. Now in our book we have all sorts of information, and we have more information in all these books than I can ever get through in an entire year. So I got to make sure that I cover everything I possibly can before we get into the I-step test. But more importantly to me is I got to cover everything that's on my standards that's listed for 5th and 6th grade. So chapter 3 lesson 2 is not anything that I have to teach. Those are actually 7th grade standards, mostly 8th grade standards, and definitely things that you'll learn more about when you're in your high school science classes. When we get to chapter 3 lesson 3, then I only need to know about half of this information as a 6th grader. So the second half, it talks about the reproduction of plants. And what I need to know as a 6th grade student is that plants are not asexual reproduction. If I look at this tree here, it looks kind of like that flatworm that when it splits apart, it's going to create 2 new worms. This tree is not splitting apart because it's so big, and therefore it's multiplying and making a clone of itself. It's not what it's doing. It just had a split in it, and it was never trimmed back. So I end up with a big branch in between the 2 giant parts of the stem. Plants are sexual reproduction. They have both the male and the female genes to reproduce. And the pollination happens from insects and birds. So they take the pollen from one tree into another tree, and then they get pollinated. Most plants are that way. Same with your flowers. The bees, they have the pollen that sticks to their legs. They fly from one flower to another. They pollinate the next flower, and we end up with more and more flowers. I don't need to know all the different parts of the flowers and the trees and things like that when it comes to the reproduction portion. That's a junior high topic. So as long as we understand that we have bacteria and we have, like flatworms and things like that are asexual reproducers, but plants are not that. The rest of this portion then that we talk about is just going to be the first half. So you'll notice I'm going to give you an assignment, but it's a short assignment because I removed all the questions to the second half of chapter 3, lesson 3. So if you miss one, it's automatically knocked down, to a B. So please take your time, make sure you read it and find the actual answers to your questions so you can do well on the assignment. There's only 7, so it shouldn't take you too long to do. The first half of chapter 3, lesson 3, deals with plant structures. So when we talk about structures, we begin at the bottom. We're going to begin with the root system. When it comes to root systems, I have 2 basic forms of roots. One is a fibrous, the other is a taproot. So let's look at what we're talking about. When it comes to fibrous roots, they look a lot like this. These are the type of plants if you have to pull out of your garden or out of your yard or out of your flower bed, that when you pull them up, you have a whole bunch of soil that sticks to these roots. So it's not a main root, it's a whole bunch of little roots that come off. When I go to pull corn, if I have to go and pull the corn stalks out of my field, or maybe they've gone beyond my field, have gotten into the ditch or something, and I go to pull them, and I go pull it up, I see all these top roots sticking out of the ground, but all these fibrous roots then hold on to this big, massive clump of dirt. It's what these fibrous roots do. They're so tiny, but they spread all out to get as much moisture as they possibly can. The opposite to that is having one main root with a bunch of little side roots that grow off the side, or hair roots. This taproot, this would be like some of our sapling trees and bigger trees in this area of the United States. A lot of our trees have taproots. They go down as deep as they possibly can. One of my least favorite plants that have a taproot is a dandelion. When I was a kid, my job was to get the dandelions out of certain areas in the yard, and you'd have to go and you'd have to dig, and if you couldn't pull it all out, you left part of this taproot that seemed to be 1.5 feet underground, then you just end up with a dandelion growing out of it. So this taproot, it's digging as deep as it possibly can to get the water that goes deeper in the soil. And then you got some of these little branch roots or hair roots that grow off to the side just to get it into the soil, loosen it up, but to get a little bit extra water as well. The whole idea behind a root system is that it has 2 main jobs. And then some of the roots, not all of them, but some of the roots have what we call a minor job. The 2 main jobs of every root type is to, number 1, anchor the plant to the ground. So there are plants that you can see that are in hanging pots that don't even have any soil, and the roots are exposed to the air and exposed to the moisture. Orchids are one of those type of plants. They don't even grow in the ground. They grow to the sides of trees in tropical areas. Their germinated seeds get stuck to the sides of the trees. They don't hurt the tree. They just stick to the side. The roots are exposed to the air because there's so much water vapor in the air, but the ground, they can't get to the light. So they stick to the top of these trees. Their roots are exposed to the air, and it's just absorbing the moisture out of it, sending it to the leaves, up the stem, and into the flowers, and they continue to grow. But these type of organisms that we're talking about, they want to be stuck in the ground because not only do they need the water, but they also need the minerals. And that's the second main job of roots. They're going to absorb water and minerals and hold them in together and pull them into the plant. The minor job that some roots have, and not all roots have it, is that they're going to sometimes store food in there too. When you have hibernating trees like we do, our deciduous trees, they do store food into their roots. And that way, when the tree is hibernating and not creating food through photosynthesis, it's going to use the water and the food that's stored in the root system throughout the winter until they go into their growing season once again. When I look at in my book at page 101, then you just have to recognize with the first letter either a T for tap or an F for fibrous. It's not true or false, by the way, but you have to recognize which is which. So in your book, hopefully you can do that real quick and write the T for the taproot and an F for fibrous, and it should be pretty easy. This is a one root system with root hairs, so you would write a T for the taproot, and then this has a whole bunch of root systems. That's just basic grass that you would find out in your yard. If I would try to grab a hold of the top of that grass and pull it up, I'm going to get a whole bunch of soil because those fibrous roots spread out and they grab onto as much soil as they can, so they're anchoring themselves to it. So I put the F for fibrous, and then I'm ready to look at the idea of a root cap. Now a root cap is at the end of every root, if that be a fibrous root or if it be a tap root. I have all of these different things that I can learn about. Well, I don't need to learn about those until I get into higher sciences, but there's a couple main things I do need to learn about when it comes to tap roots. Number one, the tap root protects the main portion of the roots, the valuable part. It has all of this protected cells right here, so it pushes through the soil. It's kind of a hard substance. I kind of look at this as your teeth. You have all sorts of enamel and hard substances when it comes to your teeth that protect the root of your teeth. If you get a cavity and that root is exposed, it causes a lot of pain. If I have these inner portions of the root exposed on the plant, it's going to cause pain and damage to the root. So I have all of this protective material from the vital portions of the root that help it push through the soil and make its way. If it hits a rock, it's going to go down or around or above it, and it's going to make its way through the soil until it can get to the water supply that it's seeking out. So when we talk about that then, going back to chapter 3, lesson 1, with a couple words that we revisited, was the idea of flow. Remember that phloem starts with the F sound, so it's talking about food. So when I have roots, then I see on the outside here, these are called the phloem, these red portions, and they're going to carry the food from the leaves through the stem down to the root system, because these are part of the living plant and they need nutrients in order to be healthy. The other word is xylem, and remember that you have the WXY in the alphabet, and xylem is the XY, so water is the W. So the xylem is in the center of the root, and it's sucking water in through these little protective outside cells of the root cap. They have pores in them, just like the openings in our skin. They suck water in, and then they pull it up like a straw, up the stem, up into the leaves for photosynthesis to be able to take place. So then we look at the stems, and we have a couple of different types of stems. We have what is called a woody stem, and when we talk about woody stems, we're talking about something that we would classify as wood. most of our trees would be classified as wood, right? So woody stems look in like several different types of forms. We can have really rough bark, we can have peeling bark, we can have smooth bark, but it's still the stem right above the roots of the plant. The other type of stem that we have is this herbaceous. Now, I'm going to be honest with you, I've never had to teach the term herbaceous until we changed our standards 2 years ago in 6th grade science. It was always just, well, this is the stem of the plant and I'm good to go. But there's nothing wrong with learning about herbaceous. It's the stem of a plant that's not wood. Should be pretty easy to understand. When I talk about different types of plants that have long stems, then they're going to be a herbaceous stem. That's asparagus, and we eat the tops and the stems of asparagus as a vegetable. But we also have different types of flowers that we could talk about, and their stems are herbaceous as well. They don't create this wood substance that we would consider wood. Now they could be hard, like different types of blade grass and reed grasses, but there's not a thick layer of wood to them. So we have woody stems, we have herbaceous stems, and the stems are right above the root systems, and they carry the water and the nutrients throughout the plant up to the leaves where the photosynthesis is taking place. So when I look at stems, this would be a woody stem, obviously, and there's a couple of different layers to the woody stem that we would like to talk about. First thing that we talk about is the bark. It's the outside protective layer. It's going to protect the tree in all of this nourishment section, which is right here in the middle below the bark. We also have the phloem, and once again the phloem is the food. The phloem is created new every year. It's kind of like how our skin sheds even though we don't look at it, but our skin has dead skin cells that fall off and new skin cells that are created underneath. Bark is the same way. It's on the outside, it doesn't fall off. However, it adds a new layer of phloem, the organism of the plant that carries the food from the leaves down to the roots. We have the cambium then, and the cambium is right underneath the phloem. What the cambium is, it's a cell that splits in half basically. On the inside, if the bark is over here and the inside of the wood is over here, it splits apart each year. It creates phloem and it creates xylem. So underneath the bark is the phloem, where the food is carried up and down throughout the tree, and then the xylem is what's going to carry the water. So this portion here that's lighter wood is active xylem. The center portion, this darker part of the tree, it's called the heartwood. It's inactive xylem. So this is where the moisture is carried, the water is carried up and down throughout the tree in the stem, from the leaves down to the roots and all through. This portion becomes inactive. And inactive just means it no longer is going to carry water in it. So if you know anything about cutting down trees and splitting wood, you'll see that there's a lot of moisture on this outside portion and not hardly any moisture on the very inside of that tree. And then maybe you've heard people talk about, well, I can tell how old a tree is by counting the rings. And they're absolutely right. Those are called growth rings. From the very first year, this black, dark brown spot in the center was its first year of growth. And every year you have a lighter ring followed by a dark ring. A lighter ring followed by a dark ring. So you have old xylem, and then that would have been the new layer of phloem. And then you would have old xylem with the new layer of phloem. Old xylem with the new layer of phloem. And as the years go, you can count how many years it goes. The thicker it is, then the more water, the more moisture that it had that year to grow with. The thinner it is, less moisture. There was a drought or something going on during that season. So those are growth rings, and I can figure out how old a tree is by counting the growth rings from the center out. So basically you're counting the radius, how far it would go across on a circle. Then I'm left with leaves. The leaves are designed in different layers. So this doesn't look like the shape of the leaf because it's not. It's a cross section. If I would lay a leaf flat and cut it, then I would be able to see these different leaves with a microscope. One of them that we talked about in the first video was the cuticle. The waxy cuticle, once again, keeps and traps water inside of the leaf. That's important because without water, then I can't have photosynthesis. And without photosynthesis, my plant's going to die. It doesn't just happen with trees, it's any plant there is. Grass looks the same way. So when I talk about all these different portions, this is where my photosynthesis takes place. Notice the chloroplast. I have an upper and a lower epidermis. So if I would look at my arm, I talk about the skin at the top would be the upper epidermis, and the skin at the bottom would be the lower epidermis, and then I'd have all this information of things in between with the muscles and the veins and the arteries and the bones. Well, this is the cross section between the upper and the lower layers of skin of the leaf, and then the top part is where my big layer of chloroplast is going to be located. Excuse me. That's where the majority of my photosynthesis is going to take place. Down here, notice they're more spaced out. I also have a vein here, and the vein is basically a straw that passes through the leaf and is an exchange area for the food and for the water. This gas, though, that's a space, is a mixture of carbon dioxide and oxygen because I have a doorway down here. This doorway is protected by two main doors. Right now, this is open. The opening itself is called the stoma, or I could have more than one, it'd be a stomata. But it's protected by these two doors, and when those two doors are open, I have an exchange going on. So if you think about the idea of double doors, that's what your guard cells are. Double doors are two doors that open and close in the same direction. When they're closed, I don't have an exchange going on. But once they're open, then I can have oxygen leaving the leaf because it's a byproduct of photosynthesis. It's given off. And I can have carbon dioxide coming in because that's what's needed for photosynthesis to happen. So those are exchanged at the same time. It's not like I have a door for oxygen and a door for carbon dioxide. In the stoma, I have an even exchange going on. Oxygen is going to be leaving the cell. At the same time, carbon dioxide is going to be going into the cell, and photosynthesis then can take place in these upper levels. The one other thing that's also going to leave the cell is that water, when we talked about in the last video, when we talked about transpiration. Transpiration, once again, is the giving off of water through the openings in the bottom of a leaf. But the water will also go out of these guard cells where the stoma is located. So now we get to page 105, and we only have a couple questions that we're going to answer here. So if I go too fast, pause the video and get your book filled out. What are the functions of the stem? So functions, I have more than one. They provide support. The plant has to be able to stand up. It's reaching for the sun where it's going to get the energy for photosynthesis to take place. But it also is designed to carry the nutrients and the water throughout the plant. So in the stem, I have xylem carrying water from the roots up to the leafy part, and I have the phloem, after photosynthesis happens, sending food down throughout the entire plant. The second question, if you forget to water the plant, then what's going to happen to the stomata, which is more than one stoma? Are they going to be open or are they going to be closed? Well, if I forget to water a plant, and you see that it's beginning to wilt, if I would look at the plants really close with a microscope and I would locate a stoma, I would see that it's closed. Because the last thing a plant wants to do is to lose more water. It wants to reduce the transpiration that it's automatically going to want to do. So it closes those doors and it keeps any extra water from leaving the plant. And it's for its protection until it can get more water to where it can fill up the cells again. Its stem can become nice and strong and straight, and it can reach towards the sun to have that photosynthesis energy. So that's all there is to this section. I know it's going to take most of your class, but your assignment is only 7 questions. Please read the section in your book and locate your answers. This is not difficult. It's just that all your answers are in the very first section. We don't need to go to part 2 of chapter 3.